Okay. All right. We are recording. So I'm here with Bobby Casey today. Bobby is the managing director of Global Wealth Protection. He's based in Europe and he's here to talk to us about digital nomads, how he helps digital nomads, kind of what the worldview looks like from the perspective of entrepreneurs and digital nomads today, and his thoughts on independent thinking. So, Bobby, thank you for joining me today. Happy to see you again.
Thanks for having me on, Matt. Good to see you again as well in your enormous library of
Yes.
bookshelf back there.
Too many. It's just a reminder of procrastination, though, if I really think about it. So not really a good thing. But tell me, tell everybody about a little bit about your business and what you do and the customers you primarily serve.
Well, my primary business is I work with location independent entrepreneurs with basically tax and residency planning. So it's a very complex topic, and problem is locally most people don't have a resource to go to for that because, for example, you live in Colorado, you go down to your local tax attorney in Denver or a local CPA, and his frame of reference and his knowledge base is pretty narrow because, and from a pragmatic standpoint, it's going to be a relatively narrow focus because why would he bother dealing with learning all about a scenario where he may only encounter once every 5 years, right?
Right.
So, but we're in this environment. Well, of course, we'll see about COVID or this situation,
Right.
but we've been in a trend for remote work and location independent. I have some theories on that we can discuss if you want to at some point on why it happened and how it happened, but the fact, no matter what, we're in this trend where it's a growing segment of people that are working remotely or solopreneurs or, they're building virtual businesses. And so it's becoming, this huge trend. But what happens is you end up in potentially a complex situation. For example, let's say you're an American, you've got maybe, let's say a SaaS business, software business, and you decide to live in Thailand and it's completely virtual. You have no employees, no office space, maybe some freelancers or virtual assistants or some designers, developers, that type of thing. So you've got to answer a lot of questions. What's what's the ideal environment to register the company? Do I pay tax in the US? How do I minimize that? Do I pay tax in Thailand? What do I claim as my tax home, my tax residency? How do I deal with things like, getting visas? Where do I have my driver's license? Silly things like this. And it becomes a complex thing. Or, another example, let's say you're a German, you're living in Medellin, Colombia, and you've got an e-commerce business selling on Amazon. Where do you do a German company? Do you register it somewhere else? A U.S. company? You're living in Colombia? Are you a Colombian taxpayer? So, and the problem is, if you're an American, I keep using Colorado as an example. If you go to your local CPA, your local tax attorney, he's probably never had a client like that, or maybe one 5 years ago, and he doesn't really have nor should he. Why would he
Right.
devote that much time and energy into learning these processes? So, like, a lot of people come to me and say, yeah, but using the German as the example, they say, well, what do you know about the German tax system? I'm a German with a Amazon business living in Colombia. What do you know about the German tax system? Well, the reality is I don't need to. I know the general principles of the various tax systems of the countries. I don't need to know how you register your company in Germany and how to minimize your tax burden there and maximize your expenses and so forth. I don't need to be a German accountant. What I need to know is a very specialized knowledge, and that's where to register your company to maximize your efficiency and how you can extract yourself from that tax system in general.
Right. So
So
there's a lot of basically there's each jurisdiction has its own tax law, and depending upon that tax law, you can be structured in a way that can save you a lot of money on taxes. You could be paying unnecessary taxes and not know it. And also, there's an asset protection component to all this too, I assume.
yeah, and actually, your point is most people are paying an unnecessary amount of taxes in this scenario. Location independent people, they
Yeah.
do pay an unnecessary amount of tax because they don't really know. I gave a presentation on at a conference last year, and I said, one of the biggest mistakes you make as a location independent entrepreneur, your most expensive mistake you probably make every year is overpaying on your taxes. You know, for math's sake, if you overpay on your taxes by 50,000, well, think about what you could have done with that
Right.
50,000, right? You could
Right.
have hired a couple of, VAs. You could have, dumped a bunch more money into inventory if you have a product based business. I mean, so many more things you could have done to grow your business. And this is what a lot of people, this is always a moral argument with certain people, but they say, oh, but I have this moral obligation to pay tax. I kind of look at it a different way. As you know, I have different views, probably a little bit similar to your views in this, but um, I look at it like this. The economy grows through the efforts of entrepreneurs and investors. The more money we keep in our pocket, the more people we can hire and put to work, the more R&D we can put into developing better products and services or helping more people, and instead of throwing it at unnecessary government expenditures that we have no control over how it's spent.
Well, I think it, you can, think you definitely can look at it from the ethical standpoint, like as you describe, and go, well, your responsibility is to smart deployment of capital, to be able to make sure that that you're producing the most with the capital that you have. Um, and I think that makes a lot of sense because it's not even, you could get in lots of arguments about, libertarian arguments and anarchist arguments about it. But for me, it's even just the idea that would you automatically overpay for everything else you buy in your life? Like, let's say, you go to the grocery
Valid point.
store and the tab is 120. Would you just give them 150 and be like, you guys seem like good people. You'll probably do good things with it, and you probably need the money more than I do. And I think that every expense in your life, would you do that? No, you wouldn't. Of course, you wouldn't do that. And I think that because taxes are so difficult to understand, I think people, can find themselves overpaying and not knowing it. But also, there's also a risk of falling out of compliance by not understanding your obligations. If you're if you're location independent, if you're traveling internationally, if you're living, so digital nomad or whatever, you could find yourself, you know, running afoul of tax law, not just in your home country but elsewhere, simply by not understanding it, by just assuming that it's not an
True.
issue. So it makes sense
Yeah.
to dig into it and find out. So if you want to know more about taxes and saving money on taxes and learning about, international structuring, definitely go to globalwealthprotection.com. That's Bobby's site, and there's all kinds of resources on there. But I'm curious about what you're seeing today, where it's now the end of August, and this COVID thing, whatever this is, has been going on for many months now. I'm curious what you see among you're based in Europe, and from there, what you see among all the entrepreneurial folks you normally work with, these location independent people. What's changed for them? Is the environment harder, easier? What's changed?
Of course, a lot of location independent entrepreneurs and digital nomad types got kind of trapped where they were sitting.
Mm,
And I know I do know some people that have been deported.
really?
Um, yeah, for example, they were in like the Philippines, for example, and during this COVID thing, and they had nowhere to go. They couldn't get flights, um, and there was nowhere to go. And all of a sudden, they're overstaying a tourist visa, and then the government offices are closed. You can't go get a visa extension or try to file, or apply for residency. And I had one Italian friend of mine. Actually, he was in Cambodia. He was in Cambodia as an Italian. This was back in March.
Hmm.
They deported him only because he was Italian.
Oh wow, because that was a
Because
big
early
hotspot then.
on, yeah, because early on, Italians, or not Italians, but Italy was a hotspot for COVID. And he literally got a call one day from the police and said, I don't remember. I think they gave him 3 days to get out of the country.
Wow.
So it's a little weird, but I try to take a positive approach on this because I actually believe COVID is a gift for uh, remote workers and digital nomads, location independent people. And I don't mean immediately. I'm talking about in the long run, because what have we seen since March? office is closing.
Yep.
Everyone's working from home,
Hmm.
most people, even big companies. I think, was it Twitter a couple of weeks ago said they're giving all their employees the ability to work from home. Tons of huge companies now are saying, you know what, you guys can work from home. Well, you've probably read it, the Tim Ferriss book, 4 Hour Work Week. I don't know what, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whenever it first came out. Well, Tim talked about in that book the idea, if you're an employee and you want to do remote work and have this location independent lifestyle, go to your boss and say, hey, how about you let me work from home 1 day a week, and then two, and then three, and you grow it and grow it. Well, what happened in March is it was boom, all at once, you're at home, right?
Right.
And so from the 4 hour work week perspective, what you were kind of Ferris's recommendation was to kind of prove yourself over the course of a couple of months, and then go back and ask for this like permanent remote work environment. But now, since March, you've got millions of people working from home that can automatically say, well, look right here, I've been just as productive, if not more productive,
Right.
working from home.
Yeah, the stigma has
Um,
definitely been erased, and even in my company, I thought, and I worked remote a lot of my life, but in my company, I thought, it seemed like a high risk test if we were to basically move everyone remote. If we were allowed to allow that kind of flexibility to everybody, and even so, whom I'm a believer in remote work, and I've been most productive when I've been working remote, over the course of my life, I had I was not really open to the idea. I made many people relocate to Denver for our company. But on, I guess it was February 24th, I think was the last day our offices were open, and we've been remote since then. And people could go in and use the office if they wanted to, but for the most part, everyone's been remote and everyone's been very productive. So kind of the prior assumptions I had, and I'm sure every employer has, from small companies like mine up to J.P. Morgan and Twitter. They're thinking, I really don't think we need these offices, and I don't think we need to
yep.
make everyone be here and these come to work every day, which seems like we're making it work regardless. So it's a huge
Well,
change.
right. And think so. You think about the kind of the the ripple effect from that, right? So you've got, like in New York, you've got these huge high-rise office buildings, and
Empty.
they're ghost towns, right? They're empty. Something will happen eventually once this kind of settles out, but it won't be office space going back in there.
Hmm.
Um, and you've got to think, like, 10 years ago, it wasn't necessarily practical to work from home because technology wise, I mean, we're on Zoom right now. You and we are uh, 9 time zones away from each other at the
Yep.
moment, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, I think 9 time zones away from each other at the moment. And the bandwidth is fantastic. 10 years ago, this wasn't, we could kind of sort of use Skype a little bit, but you remember 10 years ago using Skype. Like, you could do video, it would get glitchy, and inevitably everyone says, hey, why don't we just turn off the video and do audio because,
Right.
pictures aren't working right.
In fact, I was living in Argentina then, and I would do Skype calls with people back in the States, and it was very difficult. And exactly as you're saying, you'd end up having to turn it off because it just couldn't stand it.
Yeah. So technologically, we have the technology, kind of redundant. We have the technology to not go back to the office. Yeah,
Right.
it's going to be a shift. And, like even you said, you're used to remote working, but then you're in your mind for your own company, you're like,
You're right.
I don't
Exactly.
know.
And there are trade-offs. There are real trade-offs, but I think that
Sure.
on the whole, the benefits are there are a lot of benefits there. It changes who you can hire, and I guess this gets to the location independent people you're talking about. The benefit that will accrue to them is because they no longer have to be in a particular place in order to get certain gigs, in order to do certain work, or because it's been normalized essentially that distributed work can happen. That the market for that should grow, and so where you are and where you want can be where you want to be, and who you work for expands dramatically from what it was before.
Yeah, like think about your own company. Now you've kind of settled into it, and you're thinking, maybe I don't even need the office anymore. Maybe I need a smaller office just for like monthly meetings or something.
Yep, exactly.
And now you start thinking like, I don't know. Maybe I don't need to only hire people in Denver. Maybe I can look for the best and the brightest anywhere in the world. I can hire, that 22-year-old Russian kid living in Vladivostok who speaks perfect English or something, right?
Right.
And you start thinking like, man, like it opens things up. But I think it truly is a gift for people who want to work remotely because, like, you think about before, like how many people in California, like especially Southern California, had a 2-hour commute to work
I know.
every day?
Unbelievable. Yep.
I mean, I I've been working, you know, more or less remotely, my entire adult life since I was 19 years old. Back in my 20s into early 30s, I actually had a physical office, and I went so infrequently. My office staff, when I would show up, would be like, "Oh, can I help you, sir? Do you have a meeting here?" They used to joke with me like if I'd show up, and but now we don't really need that type of environment anymore, and so people can say, I don't need to commute that 2 hours to work. I'm going to sit here, and it improves the quality of life. So, imagine that guy who's commuting 2 hours into LA from work because he can't afford to live in LA because he doesn't make, you know, $17 million a year to buy the house. You got to have,
Mhm.
he doesn't have the budget to buy the stupid expensive housing they've got there. And he goes, I can keep doing the same job working from home, don't have to commute. I just added 4 hours of absolute quality of life improvement to
Mhm.
my life.
And I think this would be hard to do on an individual basis to make these decisions because I think what COVID has done is it normalized this so that everyone at all levels of the organization had to do it. And because of that, then now everyone recognizes it really wasn't a big deal. But no one would have been the first to move on it, I don't think. I think it would have been really hard for it to evolve that way in any big way anyway. I think it's because just like how you saw that everyone was still moving to San Francisco, even though it was falling, it was just going into the gutter. You still had a huge number of people there because the opportunities there were unique, you know?
Yeah. Well, it's like I was just thinking about this. Like, imagine you now have this extra 4 hours a day in your week. Well, also a lot of your time in the office is wasted time. I would say an average day you waste 30% of your day kind of in meaningless conversations, some kind of nonsense meeting, you
Yeah.
know, whatever. If you can, and it takes a mental shift, right? I mean, you're going to have to make a hard mental shift to remain intently focused to get your work done. But if you can do that, a normal 8-hour workday you can probably squeeze into 5 hours, right, and be just as productive. Now you actually work 3 hours less, actually sitting there looking at your screen or whatever you're doing, 3 hours less. On top of that, you got an extra 4 hours. You're not driving to and from work. I mean, my God, you can like go have 2 hour
Doubled your
lunch with
life.
your spouse. Yeah, you go have a 2 hour lunch with your spouse. Take your kids to the park because also they're at home now too.
Yep.
But you think about the ripple effect of some of that stuff, the real estate, 3, 4 bedroom house in the suburbs. Now, all of a sudden, your spouse, and both your kids are working from home.
Mm.
Well, you didn't buy that house with the intent of having 4 separate office spaces in there,
You need a bigger
right?
house.
Need a bigger house, or maybe you need to build a guest house in the back. But anyway, it opens up other opportunities for people kind of identifying these things, like this tiny house movement. Maybe people start building small houses in their backyard for office space or something like that.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I,
I'm
I
just
think
thinking like the repercussions are enormous when you think about it.
I think you're right. I think it's just a huge shift, and I think it's still like all of the economic fallout of COVID is still poorly understood by people. I think it's just there's so many opportunities. It's
Oh, sure.
the box was if the world is a box, and it was basically stable, it's been shook crazily, and now everything is up in the air, so many things can change.
Right.
Now the thing is, I know that you work with obviously a lot of people that are international, so people that are digital nomad types. I just wonder, my thesis is actually that we the peak travel. We will. I don't think we in our lifetime will see travel that's as free and easy, meaning low cost and just borders being open to you and all that, I don't think we'll see that again the way it was, let's say, in 2018. I just don't see that coming back as strong. What do you think about that as a guy who's lives internationally, has traveled back and forth to the States a couple times during COVID? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was actually just talking to a friend of mine the other day about exactly this topic. You got to think like I just read last week. There was an article that came out. Delta Airlines had its busiest travel day since like March 17th or something like that. Just had its busiest travel day since March 17th. The problem is that number is still 70% below
Mm,
last year's comparable period. 70% below last year's period.
insane.
Now think about that from a business planning standpoint. Your CEO or upper management in Delta. Delta has a massive, or any of the airlines, they have massive infrastructure just to keep the lights on every day, right? It's not like my infrastructure. Like I don't have any infrastructure almost. I'm working remotely from my house. My entire team works remotely. We've been doing this for years. Basically, all they need is enough money to pay their rent and to justify keeping the work for me every day, right?
Right.
So, but Delta needs massive. So there's a baseline they have to maintain, right? Well, how do you make big, major financial decisions knowing that number one, your business is 70% off, and at the stroke of the pen of Congress, you could be shut down at a whim? Like, how do you make a year out planning decision when you have absolutely no control about the future of your business? So, what
Yeah,
do you think is going to happen with the airlines? Exactly what's happening is they're closing routes down. They're parking airplanes. You're right. We're done with this open, free, like travel schedule. I literally just bought a plane ticket today. I'm going next week to Mexico, and my flight, it's like a 40-hour trip to get
and
there.
just to put that in perspective, what would it have been last year at this time?
20.
20.
Because I have every step of the way, I have long or overnight layovers because there's just not enough flights to like piece together an efficient trip. It doesn't exist anymore.
What about crossing international borders? Is that how do you see that evolving? Because that's one. I mean, certainly the commercial aspect where you had all these airlines that in so many different routes, so it made it cheap and easily accessible. But it seems to me clearly international borders have been raised, and I mean, even your Italian friend getting kicked out of Cambodia, like that kind of thing would have been unheard of a year ago. I mean, the
Right.
Italian tourist is a welcome sight in Cambodia because
Yeah.
the economic stimulus to the economy, they do good for the place. So
It's I think it's going to take a little bit of time to kind of sort itself out. But speaking of the airline industries, I mean, for years, not years, decades, their bread and butter is business travelers,
right,
right? I mean, it's the guy the salesman that gets on the plane Monday and hits his first stop and next flight Wednesday, and he's back home on Friday for the weekend. That's the airline's bread and butter. But who goes on sales calls anymore? Nobody. We do them on Zoom,
right.
right? We do them on Zoom or Skype or whatever video conferencing tool we're using. Nobody's doing these. So the bread and butter of the airline industry is gone. So who's left? People visiting family, friends, vacationers, the occasional necessary business trip, that sort of thing. But the bread and butter of the airline industry just kind of vanished in 3 months, right?
Yeah.
So when it comes to international travel, I mean, it's still a big piece of that is business. But it's like my last trip a couple weeks ago, the flight was actually pretty full. I mean, it wasn't like shoulder to shoulder the whole plane, but it was pretty full. But the reason it's pretty full is because whereas before there might have been 3 flights that day on that route, now there's 1. So
Right.
everybody's squeezed into the one plane. I think it affects the location independent people a lot at the moment. But back to my thesis anyway, that I think COVID is kind of a gift to location independent people. It, in the sense it gives people who weren't previously location independent the ability to do so. Like now, you live in LA and you work for some big company and you say, you know what, it's been my dream my whole life to live on the beach in Cabo, you know, for a couple of months a year. Well, there's nothing prohibiting you from doing that, if as long as you can make time during the day to get your work done, and you spend the
Right.
rest of the time, walking on the beach in Cabo.
Right.
And so it opens up that opportunity that I don't think we had. I mean, we did, but
No, I agree with you
small.
100%. I think you're totally right. I think that's a huge trend, and there's a big opportunity there for people who are willing to exploit it. And there's even opportunities, I guess, around, you'd imagine, providing services that help match up employer, employee, and contract roles. I know there are services out there that there are tools that do this, but you just have to imagine that um, the need from employers is going to go up, and the desire for employees to be remote is going to go up. And so, when you're running job ads, typically you're running them based upon the city that you're in. I mean, it's like the key in the database is the city where the job is. And so it seems like it changes all that, and there could be some opportunities there, I think, too, matching people up. But I also think that one of the things that's come out of this, frankly, is that I think a lot of people have learned how unproductive their organizations were. Uh, like that they were really had a lot of dead wood, in the business. They had employees that really weren't necessary
Right,
who
right.
went remote. So while you did find that most people were just as productive, if not more productive, you also found out the people that were basically just political actors. They were
Right.
bureaucrats in the whole regime. So I think that I do wonder if employment, though, is just gonna, it's not. It just seems like it's not going to recover for a long time. Most because we're overstaffed. I think a lot of companies. But
Yeah, I think you'll probably see. I mean, I think what's the official. I mean, the official unemployment numbers also. It's always a little bit manipulated anyway. But anyway, what they're reporting, isn't it like 13, 14% right now?
it's less than that at this point. Yeah, I think last time I saw it, which honestly I haven't looked at it in the last month, I think it was a little over 10%, which is
Okay,
total
well, let's
nothing.
say 10%. And pre-COVID, it was down around what, 4% or something like that.
Not including, of course,
So
the people that weren't looking for jobs anymore, which was like
sure,
40 million people.
right. Well, I mean, I think this is going to be a major problem
Yeah.
going forward for sure. But I don't know. I think maybe I just take an overly optimistic view of humanity. I think
Mm.
we tend to sort out problems over uh, a given period of time anyway. And the workforce, to me, the workforce thing, to me, I think is a huge improvement because, like you said, like you go on one of these job sites or whatever, and you look for a job, and your frame is basically, I'm looking for a job in Denver, in Chicago, in Charlotte, in Atlanta. Now you won't be searching for a geo-specific job. You're going to be searching for a skill set, or a job title, or something like that. That also makes that job market extremely competitive, which means if you want to work, you got to raise your level. Like,
Right. It works in both areas. I mean, if you're in, Topeka, Kansas, you now have access to jobs that you would never otherwise have. And at the same time, you got to perform at a level that maybe they might in New York. And
right. Well, yeah, somebody in New York who's used to making, $180,000 a year for a job, somebody in Topeka says, "Are you kidding? I would, I would kill myself to do this for 90,000 a year."
right.
Right.
Yep. Huge opportunities. So, do you have any view on, uh, I don't know how much you get into like the economics and finance and the inflation deflation argument. I don't know how much you focus on that. I know you mostly just, from what I see, you mostly focus on uh, the independent thinking, which I definitely want to get to, and sort of libertarian ideas in many cases, and then how people can live as free individuals internationally and being location independent. But do you have a view on like the economic situation and what's coming out of this COVID situation for entrepreneurs?
Uh, well, I mean, I think November is going to be exciting
Mm.
economically. Um, you ever watch House of Cards? Netflix
Yep.
series House of Cards.
Mhm.
So I am thoroughly convinced we are living in season 6 of House of Cards.
Really? Okay.
Yes. So
I
if
did.
you remember season 6, it ended with massive voter fraud allegations, and then they couldn't pick the president, and then we had all that, like, if you remember that, the way it ended. And I
Mm.
think this is what's happening. I think we're going to end up. So from an economic standpoint, anytime there's any major, you know, uncertainty about what's happening, it's hard for people to make big decisions if
Right.
there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yep.
And as I see it, I mean, this is just my prediction. Love him or hate him, I think Trump wins by a pretty significant margin in November.
Mm.
Um, I I am not pro-Trump by any means, so by all means, save your hate mail for somebody else. I
Right.
could care less. I don't care about Biden. I don't care about Trump. I don't care about any of them.
Right.
But I just it. This is just my gut feeling. I think he wins by a pretty big margin, which means then we're going to end up with massive voter fraud allegations. I think it'll drag out actually the selection of the
Mm.
president, because we're going to have to go through a court series. I
Mm.
think we're going to end up seeing riots, because clearly there is a huge underlying anti-Trump sentiment in the U.S. right now.
Well, and I think
Um,
there's just a huge amount of anger in general. So I think that there's a very vocal anti-Trump sentiment, and but it is not acceptable to be pro-Trump. I mean, it's just not acceptable. I mean, it's dangerous to be pro-Trump, and so I think that we don't really even know how big that sentiment is, and maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's actually is maybe it is the silent majority people say, or maybe you find out that yeah, most people just don't really care. And I think regardless, there is a lot of anger and frustration among people, and I think a lot of it just being pent up, has been that is caused it even more. And the things
yeah,
these we've had this in Denver. I mean, we have things are Denver is deteriorating just like every other major city in the U.S. from what I can see. I mean, the homeless population is growing tremendously. I mean, it's growing really fast. It's getting much bigger. We've had our own fair share of protests. There were like 50 people last weekend. It only took 50 people to control the city. There were 50, uh, people, I guess, that were associated with Black Lives Matter or Antifa, but there were only 50, and they were just destroying things. They were breaking windows, whatever. The police stand down, and they controlled the city. 50 people alone, and you just think, man, imagine some of these crazy, these huge protests you see sometimes in Europe, where you have hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, and you can imagine
right.
how crazy it could get. But yeah, it's just this weird small percentage now. So I agree. There's no doubt that I guess if Biden wins, maybe we would avoid any kind of um, riots or violence immediately. But if Trump wins, or if it's close, I think that's a certainty. I just don't see how you avoid it.
I think it's pretty much a certainty if Trump wins. I think we avoid the riots if Biden wins, because at least my perception, it seems like the huge anger is on the left. They're anti-Trump, the Antifa guys or whatever, BLM. It looks like most everybody doing all the protesting for the most part is anti-Trump. So I think if he wins, then we end up with the riots. I think if Biden wins, I don't know, maybe there'll be the right, the alt right, let's call it, that'll be out there protesting. I don't think so, but you know, certainly. But the problem is, if Biden wins, I think. I mean, he's already said he's planning to raise taxes. He's
Right.
pushing towards some version of socialized medicine. I think
Taking
Wall Street
guns.
will hate that. Yeah, he's got an issue with guns. I think Wall Street's going to hate that. Um, and from back to your question, economically, I think it's a bad sign. Economically, if Biden wins, it's a bad sign socially if Trump wins.
Right.
So flip a coin. Which one, which shitstorm do you want to live with, right? So
Right. Is there so you have a global view. Is there a safe haven in the world now? Because it's not like these problems that are happening in the US are not just they're not exclusive to the US.
you're
There's
right. I could tell you, yeah, I've been doing a lot of research into this. Um, Problem is, as an American right now, there's only about 30 countries you can actually go to.
Mhm.
This is the big problem. The US at the beginning of the year, you had about 185 countries you could travel to visa free. As of right now, it's down to about 30.
Hmm.
Most of the world does not allow American passport holders to enter. So there are plenty of safe havens, yes. Problem is, if you're an American, how do you get to them?
Hmm.
That's what are you going to do? Like hide in a shipping container for 3 weeks? Like you're not. It's not easy. It's not easy to do. So, um, if I were an American and I was looking to escape the U.S. right now, I would probably look at Mexico or Brazil.
Hmm.
Um, that I would not. I would not even consider any other Central or South American country at all.
Hmm.
Wouldn't even be a consideration for me because most of those other countries went full on totalitarian. Like Panama, for example, you couldn't even like men could only be outside 2 times a week for 2 hours a day. Women 3 times a week, 2 hours a day. You couldn't even go for a walk with your wife. You weren't allowed to be outside on the same days at the same time.
My friends were there, and they had to get a medical evac to get out of there, even to get back to the U.S. Now these are people who always imagined if they were going to if there were difficulties in the U.S. that they would go somewhere internationally, and Panama was one of those places where they had a residence. They had a community there. They had people they liked. They liked the place a lot, and it just got so draconian, as you're saying, that they wanted to get out and they couldn't get out except for medical reasons and having chartering a plane and doing a medical evac.
Yeah, Panama, Colombia is the same way. I talked to a client of mine last week who lives in Medellin, Canadian guy. He told me, he said he feels like he's been in prison for 4 months.
Mm.
He said it's terrible. He said like he can barely leave his house. If he goes to work, like he can't even veer off the path to get to his office. Like if he's caught in the wrong part of town, like he can get fined and go to jail. Like it's
Crazy,
crazy.
crazy.
I talked to another guy last night in South Africa. He said something similar. They're still under curfew. He told me last night or yesterday when we talked. Um, he said that South Africa has arrested more people for like COVID violations than people have actually gotten COVID.
Wow. Then more documented infections. There's been more arrests than infections.
More arrests than documented infections
Wow.
related to like things like walking your dog at 10:30 at night. You get arrested because you're not supposed to be out after 10 or out without a mask on. You go to jail in
Hmm.
South Africa, no mask on.
That's
So,
terrifying. I know that people in Buenos Aires, been locked in their
oh
apartments,
yeah,
for
Argentina's
many months.
terrible.
Doug
Chile is terrible.
Doug Casey, and there's no relation, but obviously I know you know Doug.
I
Um,
do. Yeah, good guy. I really like Doug.
Doug's an incredible human. He's in his ranch in Uruguay, has basically been kind of stuck there. But where he is, he's like you would never know anything's any different. And but you got to
He's
wonder,
countryside though. He's not in a city.
right? And I think that's probably the one of the strongest elements that you see a lot of people coming to this realization that being in an urban environment, the risk reward ratio, partially because of the remote work, partially because of the violence, but partially because of the government crackdown on these on the wearing masks or whatever, it's totally shifted. And now it just makes sense. I mean, even me personally, like I rented a ranch 40 miles outside of the city, and I'm putting my house on the market. I mean, because it's just like, first of all, I think the real estate's ridiculously expensive, but also, I don't really want to be, 2 miles away from, where people are rioting. It just doesn't seem like.
Right. Oh yeah, yeah. No, My wife and I have been shopping for country houses the past couple of months. We're looking at doing it too. I still want to keep my city apartment because I like living in the city. Plus, where I live, it's incredibly safe. Like I live in Riga, Latvia. That's my main home. You know, it's crazy. Like back in March, the government issued like a recommendation to wear masks that lasted for about a week, and everyone's like, "Nah, I'm not doing that anymore." We didn't really have any lockdown. I mean, we had for about a month all the gyms and like gyms and movie theaters, concerts, stuff like that was closed down. They did close the borders of Latvia, the external borders,
Mm.
meaning not EU borders, right? So, like Estonia or Lithuania could come into Latvia, but Russians could not because
Mm.
it's a not an EU border. So they did close the external borders for a while, um, but as far as like it's completely normal here. Like everything's open. I could go to the movies. Gyms are
Mm.
open. I haven't seen a mask in weeks, except for at the I had a doctor's appointment a couple of weeks ago. You do have to wear a mask in the doctor's office. Oh, and I renewed my passport last week at the U.S. Embassy. Is the only place. Oh, by the way, the doctor. It's only a recommendation that you wear the mask, but I
Mm.
wear it because they ask you to.
Yeah,
But the
courtesy.
U.S. Embassy is the only place in the country where it's a mandated requirement
Mm.
to wear a mask, which I find hugely entertaining that the entire country doesn't require it, but you go into this little tiny piece of property that's technically considered United States, and all of a sudden the virus is dangerous right there.
Yeah, it's definitely the rules here are pretty crazy, and they're obviously they vary by state. But a lot of the Western states were kind of holdouts in adopting mandatory mask requirements and stuff like that. But
Well,
they
except for California.
right, I don't know if I consider them a Western state, even though they are Western state. But yeah, but they're it's fully adopted here now. I mean, everywhere, and so you wear masks if you're going anywhere in public. You wear masks, but also I think the worst part is that um, there's nowhere to go anyway because they basically have made it so difficult. Even when you go to restaurants, it's they can only have half the people in there. A lot of the restaurants have just gone out of business, and more are going to go out of business.
Sure, yeah.
My gyms are closed. They reopened some gyms, but my gym didn't make the cut. They're out. They're out of business. So it's like there's it's sort of the restrictions that caused uh, that I guess they're almost like you have these tight government regulations that basically most businesses cannot meet, and so they end up just disappearing, and then it just takes away all the interesting stuff to do anyway. I mean, it's terrible. It's terrible.
Right. Yeah. It's like here, I could walk like before our call, like today is kind of a Thursdays are usually a slower work day for me.
Mhm.
So I went out. I had one quick meeting, and then I had went for a long walk. I'm listening to an audible book, walking around the city, had a long lunch, stopped for a coffee, brought it back with me. And nothing. Like I can go to any restaurant, everything's open, bars. If I wanted to go to nightclubs, the gyms are all open. So you asked me, like back to your original question on this topic is do I see any places where freedom is, still respected? I think all of Eastern Europe is good. And I kind of have a thesis for this as well. I think Eastern Europe was under the thumb of the Soviet Union for so long. This generation of people in Eastern Europe, they still remember how terrible it was to be under this totalitarian regime
Mhm.
where you couldn't do anything, you couldn't say the right things if you disagreed with somebody. And so this generation of Latvians and Estonians and Lithuanians and Czechs and so on, this generation, they've had it. They don't trust government. They're not going to do. Well, it's like I said, they had a recommendation to wear masks for a week, or they had a recommendation, and basically people are like, "Nah, I'm not wearing this. I'm
Right.
not going to do it." They just don't do it, and so they take I think a bit more practical approach here, and people. I mean, yeah, like I said, they closed the exterior borders. No flights from China, of course. If you come from, I forget there, if there's more than 16 infections per 10,000 or something like that. But if your country reaches a certain threshold of infections per 10,000 or 100,000 people, whatever it is, then you go into a different category. And if you're entering Latvia from a country in that category, you're required to quarantine at home for 14 days. So, I mean, there is still some of that stuff, but, I think it's a reason. I think they took a reasonable response to it, whereas a lot of countries just didn't. And actually, my biggest concern about the response, the U.S. federally, let's say, didn't necessarily take a crazy response, but it's the state level that went
Right.
crazy, and pretty much all the states did. Right.
And some of them
Like,
they went full autocrat pretty quickly.
oh my God, yeah. I mean, I'm originally from North Carolina. I was in North Carolina a few weeks ago, and I was dumbfounded watching people in the park. Walking. So my son and I, we have one wheels. These one wheel skateboards. Yep. Yeah. I'm not a hipster, but I still have one. But my son and I were riding, our one wheels in the park, just playing around, and I'm watching people walking through the park, walking their dog, nowhere near them, nobody around them, with masks on, and I'm thinking, like, what's wrong with you people? This is my biggest concern is the vast majority of Americans, at least my perception, the vast majority of Americans are so easily manipulated, and they're so willing to just fall in line and follow the rules, whether they take any thoughtful approach to what's going on. They just say, well, okay, yeah, I better do it.
I think
this is my biggest issue.
No, I think you're right, and I think that lends to itself to all kinds of potentially negative outcomes, because it seems that, like, you talked about the way that Latvia handled it. It seems like they handled it the only way their people would allow them to handle it, and I think that in the U.S. it's being handled the way I mean, the government's not.
Maybe that's true.
I mean, it's our system is based upon voluntary compliance. Bottom line, voluntary compliance. Like, if everyone decides that they're not going to follow something, then I mean the government can pretend that it matters. But if everyone's like, well, it doesn't matter, then they'll get ahead of it. And I think even the early stuff with the social distancing and all that, when I think people started doing it, and then the government, people in charge ran to the front of it and said, we need to mandate social distancing. But I think people were doing it on their own anyway, just to be cautious, just to be sure. We didn't know what we were dealing with. They were working on it on their own. But I agree. It's worrisome. It's definitely worrisome how quickly people have they just kind of accept what's spoon fed to them. Yeah.
The U.S. has by far the best propaganda machine ever in the history of centralized authority. I have a little bit of a theory on this. Rome collapsed because basically the people lost faith in their government and the money supply also, right? I mean, a big part of the fall of Rome was money supply. But what did Rome really do well? They entertained their people well. They were very very into the arts and sports, and those huge like spectacular sporting events all the time. So they did a great job of entertaining people, kind of like in the United States. The U.S. does a great job of entertaining people. Hockey, football, basketball, NASCAR, American Idol, all these things. We do a great job of entertaining. Rome did a great job of entertaining, but they lost control of their people because they didn't have the control. They entertained well, but they didn't control. You take the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had the control piece down, right? I mean, you got incentivized for turning in your neighbor for saying something against the state, right? Like you got like more rations or whatever. So they did a good job of controlling the people, But what the Soviet Union never figured out was how to occupy the people's minds. So they never actually entertained the people very well. Well, what the United States has done is they've taken, and I say the best, but a little bit of sarcasm here. They took the best of the Soviet Union and the best of the Roman system and combined it. And they've created the best propaganda machine in the history of societies. And people fall for it. I mean, look at an NFL football game, right? Almost everyone in the stadium stands up and says, the Pledge of Allegiance, right? What they don't understand is that's a sponsorship deal with the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army requires the NFL to do that at the beginning of the game as part of their sponsorship deal. Like, it's crazy. Like, it's such a propaganda machine. I even told, like, my youngest son lives with his mom in the States, and I've told him, I said, you can do what you want, but when your school tells you have to get up and say the Pledge of Allegiance or something, you don't have to do that. And I explained to him how it is a brainwashing tool and how the repetitive nature of saying it over and over for years is a brainwashing tool. So now he tells me he'll stand up, but he never says the words.
Well, I think,
but it still drives into his brain, right? Like
it does. It does. And you figure, I mean, there's, I think this, I guess, gets into the big thing, the last thing I want to talk to you about, which is the independent thinking in general. And it just seems to me, that sort of critical thinking, that independent thinking, that willingness to be a contrarian, like that's diminishing as something that you see it less often in people. And maybe it's just because they feel like they need to be quiet about it. But it also doesn't seem like it's celebrated in our culture at all. Where I think when we were growing up, it did seem more that way. It did seem like being a contrarian was a good thing. Critical thinking was what was the height of educational achievement. And what do you think? What are your thoughts on, as a very independent thinker? What are your thoughts on this?
So you keep saying that with a little bit of a smirk. That means you have laughed more than once at my Facebook post.
I have, yes, I have. And I love some of the arguments you get in with people, who they're amazing. They're hilarious, and you take the time. I would just walk away from it, but you take the time to really engage them and drive the point home. And it's great.
It's part of my entertainment. It's part of my own personal entertainment. I'm just doing God's work, Matt. Doing God's work.
These days, it seems like it is God's work. It's so rare.
Honestly, so I'm going to go back to my Roman and my Soviet example. So the Soviets did a really good job of controlling the people, but they did not entertain them to occupy their minds. And during that Soviet era, what happened? It collapsed because of free thinking. You think of all the writers, the poets, the music that came out of the Soviet Union during that Soviet era. Amazing books, poetry, amazing music came out of that era because they had the free time and they had the time to think. And ultimately, that was the collapse of the Soviet Union, was the intellectual revolution that they allowed to happen. Okay, this is just my own thesis. Yeah. Okay, so, but Americans don't have time to think. When does the average American have time to go for a 2-hour walk without a distraction and just think, or sit in the study, read a book, and just think? Nobody has time for that, right? I mean, we all have 24 hours a day, right? We all have 168 hours a week. It just depends on how we allocate our time and how we prioritize it. But you think about the average American. Okay, this is, again, we're like in the pre-COVID, post-COVID thing, but you have your general work day, right? You get up in the morning, let's say 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, you get ready, you commute your half hour, whatever, to work. You're thinking about the work, stressed in the commute, rush hour traffic. You don't have time to think. You're in the car or in the office doing your work. You're not thinking. You're just, you're going through the motions of your job. You come home. What do? Honey, mow the yard. You got to do some housework, have dinner, and you kind of crash in front of the couch and watch some TV. On the
Right.
weekends, you've got chores to do around the house. You've got kids soccer, kids baseball. Maybe you go play golf with your buddies. Sunday, maybe you have a little bit of downtime, watch football. Sunday night, bed, back to work. You're in a cycle. You don't really have a lot of time to think
Right.
because you're either working or entertained.
Right.
You're
And I
busy.
think
You're
that,
too busy to have a clear thought.
right. And I think that, I mean, it's such a big idea, that we're so good. The U.S. is so good at entertaining. There's so many, um, there's a lot of perceived demands on your time. And there's a lot of real economic realities that require people to be working and focused on making money just to pay the bills. So there's that. But there are just some super shiny things happening around you all the time, that you're supposed to look at instead of having this space. And actually, I've been thinking a lot about this idea. I've used this tool in management before, where you have to, if you want to encourage good, people to step up and to step into new roles, and you want to encourage people in the company to think differently, like the biggest thing you have to do is you have to create vacuums, because until there's a vacuum, nothing new can emerge. And I think the idea with all of this entertainment, with all this idea that both you should have, if you do happen to have a two-parent household, you both really ought to be working. In fact, it says bad things about you if you don't work. You should have your kids overscheduled in all these crazy activities and play dates. You shouldn't let them do any kind
You're
of
a bad
filming.
parent, right?
Right, you're a
If
bad
your
parent.
kids aren't doing drama and baseball and basketball and volleyball and art camp, if you don't have them in at least 5 extracurricular activities, you're just a shitty parent.
Right,
Right?
exactly. And if you're a woman who doesn't want to work, then obviously you believe in, you have these negative views of women or something, or you're giving up on your, on women yourself by not by wanting to stay home. And so it's, everyone has
You're
to work
old
all the time.
fashioned. You're a woman of the 50s.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And a man who might want that is obviously just a scoundrel. I mean, it's just crazy that they would.
You're a misogynistic pig.
Exactly. But that's a really big idea. So basically, you create this environment where the virtues are pace of activity, scheduled events, everything very structured. So there's very little free form in it. So there's like that's what's valued. Then you have these economic realities that really make it so people are, working hand to mouth all the time, because everything is, always going up. It's expensive. It's hard to make things work. And then on top of that, you have just like the greatest entertainment complex that's ever existed in the face of the earth, whether that be sports or cable news. I mean,
Right.
the Republican Democrat thing is basically, it's the
House
Dallas
of
Cowboys
Cards.
versus
It's
the
House of
Giants.
Cards.
Yeah.
I told you that before. This election year it's just like watching a season of House of Cards.
Oh, man,
I'm telling
okay.
you.
I got to go back and brush up on my House of Cards. It's been a while. I'm definitely
My
gonna
God.
get it out. But
Yeah, but I will tell you, I am very optimistic about the future, and because I kind of look at things maybe as a little bit of a contrarian view, and there's so much talk about. Let me rewind just a second. I mentioned before I have a view on why this remote work environment has kind of taken off. I think it stems back to the creation of Skype, which is about roughly 15 years ago. Because I remember roughly 15 years ago, I went to Russia for a couple of weeks, visiting some friends, and went on a hunting trip out in Siberia. And of course, this was before we had internet on our phones, right? We actually had to push buttons for numbers, and if you wanted to text, you had to hit three, or you had to hit three times to get to a C, right? Remember those good old days?
Yep.
And I came home, and my phone bill was like a couple of grand. But that's about when Skype started, and Skype has opened up technologically the ability to connect with people at low or zero or almost zero cost. And so from a work standpoint, if you're a freelancer, you couldn't afford a $2,000 a month phone bill to freelance with clients all over the world. But now you can. I mean, even if you have a paid Zoom account, it's what, $20 a month,
Yep.
$30 a month, or something like that. I mean, even if you're a freelancer making $1,000 a month, $20 a month is a worthwhile tool to have in part of
Especially if you're
your
able to be
arsenal.
in a place where your cost of living is so much lower.
Right. So Skype, I think, was a big catalyst for that, and of course other technologies followed along, and as bandwidth increased and improved, other things happened. But the other big technology, I think, that has really, two big technologies I'll mention. One of them is Facebook, and I know, you know, a lot of libertarians think Facebook is the devil, and they're like Facebook.gov. They think it's just an arm for the Department of Justice. Maybe, maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe they have backdoor access, probably do. But one thing about social media is, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, or any of the others, one thing I think is phenomenal about these social media platforms, technologically, of course, who do you know that doesn't have a smartphone in their pocket right now? I mean, hell, our 5-year-old kids now have smartphones, right? They probably know how to use them better than us.
Doug Casey
So,
is the only person I know.
you know what? I could probably see that. I have one lawyer friend of mine here in Latvia, and she refuses to have a smartphone also because, she thinks she's being tracked everywhere she goes too. Probably same view as Doug.
Yeah, Doug doesn't have a cell phone at all.
But having this technology in our pocket and the ability to post it on Facebook, I think, has created a shift of awakening for people. Because if you think 25, 30 years ago, most people, when they read an article in the New York Times or they watched something on the news, there was kind of an implicit sense of trust.
Right.
I trust that journalists, that they did their due diligence, and you have this sense of trust with them that you believe it. But now, who I personally, like, that thing in Beirut a few weeks ago, the bomb with the fireworks and everything. They came out like within the first 24 hours and said it was the
Right.
fertilizer ignited by the fireworks. My first thought was, all right, who hates Lebanon? Like, was it Israel? Did Israel drop a bomb on that dock? Like, my first thought is, I don't believe them. It's my first thought. And I think this is everybody's, not everybody, but it's trending towards that way because we have such instant information that we can put in our hands now. And this is a gift from social media that we didn't have before.
It's good for individuals. It creates disorder, but in that disorder is good for especially those who are willing to think, who aren't so entertained that they'll think.
That's a valid point. It does create disorder, but you do have to engage your own thought processes as your own kind of internal filter to understand, okay, this is bullshit.
But if you believe in individuals,
bullshit.
this is all a good thing. Like if you're pro individual, if you're pro people, then these things are disorder that means there's less trust with just these authorities who dictate how things are and will formulate the narrative in the news. It's a great thing.
Sure. Well, you look like Egypt. They overthrew, they overthrew him, and that was all organized through, it was Twitter, right? I think it was all organized via Twitter. And right now, as we speak, we've got all the riots and the protests happening in Belarus. And this information is getting out because of Telegram.
Right.
This is crazy. Like, do you know the story with Telegram?
Were they WhatsApp guys who just went over and created that for
No, let me tell you. Basically, so Belarus, basically the government forced all the ISPs there to block like tens of thousands of ISPs. I mean, to block tens of thousands of IP addresses, so they couldn't get the information out to the rest of the world. They didn't want the rest of the world seeing, how the police and the military were gunning protesters down in the street. They didn't want those videos going out. Well, Telegram is two Russian guys that are very libertarian, anarchist-minded guys who created this platform. Telegram is very similar to WhatsApp. And Lukashenko, Lukashenko, his administration, they intentionally blocked all of the Telegram IP addresses because they knew people would be using it to transmit data out. So what Telegram did, they went out and started putting servers in all these parts of the world that were not blocked by Belarus. And what they did is they put up fake websites connected to the IP address on those servers, like some nonsense. Like, so if you went to the website with that IP address, you would
It would be
see
okay.
it'd be like some golfing show or something like
Right.
that. So it was kind of a fake website so they could channel all the traffic through the IP addresses of these fake websites. And this is how all the information about Belarus has gotten out.
It's amazing.
But this is a gift of social media, these social media platforms that exposes, and you're right, there is a ton of fake news, there's a ton of bullshit in there. So you do have to be a thinking person to filter it out. But we're also in a transitional phase. We got to figure this out too, right?
Right.
Like, so I think that's a huge thing. And the one last thing I bet you've never heard anybody talk about, and this is a funny theory, I think you'll at least be amused by it, is Netflix. So, how old are you? You and I are about the same age. I think.
I'm 45.
Yep. So I'm 1 year old. I just turned 46. So I thought you and I were about the same age.
Yeah.
So you and I both remember watching TV and waiting for the commercial break or the news blip that came on the break or both, and then coming back to the show. And then 10 minutes later, news blip, commercial break, back to the show, right?
Yep.
You couldn't watch TV without it, almost. Like,
And there were 3 channels.
Yeah, and you only had 3 channels: ABC, CBS, and NBC, right?
Right.
Yeah, so you only had 3 channels. And yeah, of course, we had cable TV, but still, cable TV was full of advertisements, right? Streaming TV has given us the ability to actively choose what we watch. And there's no commercials. I mean, yeah, okay, there's some product placements in shows and stuff like that, but there's no actual commercials in your Netflix series, right? And so who now watches TV, like normal network TV? Nobody.
I can't imagine.
Most people have given up cable. Most people I know have given up cable. They've got Netflix, maybe Amazon Prime, maybe Hulu or Disney Plus or something like that. But you intentionally consume the entertainment you want to consume instead of it being passively pushed onto you through these commercial breaks and stuff. Like, when we were, I don't know, this probably what, 20 years ago that kind of ended, or at least started ending.
Yeah, it started ending, but I mean, it really wasn't. You're right. This is a really new trend for most people, for sure. Really new, where you're gotten away from these programmed commercials and all that.
This is pretty new. This is like a 10-year trend where it's really been kind of mainstream, where most people have some type of streaming program that they watch. And so what that does, it gives you the ability to intentionally consume what you want. Like, maybe you want to watch documentaries on, whatever. Maybe you want to watch Family Guy or Rick and Morty, like whatever.
But,
yeah, me too. High five.
Yeah.
But you get to choose what you watch, whereas up until the past few years, you turned the channel to what you wanted to see, but you were passively consuming a lot of information that you may not have wanted to see. So anyway, this is kind of another little theory I have, that this is also part of the mental awakening people have, because we're no longer so force-fed passive information like we used to be, because we get to choose what we watch now.
Yeah, and I think everything has a trade-off. So we talked about some trade-offs with this, but just the idea that you could, it expands the size of your world, because you can follow your curiosity into subjects that would never have been spoon-fed to you by the major media. So
Yeah.
like my son got really into something recently called Forged in Fire, and it's a reality show about these guys who basically make edged weapons. And
Oh, I have seen that. Yeah, yeah. I forgot the name. Yep.
he loves it. He loves it. And I was like, I've watched probably 6 or 7 episodes with him now, and I'm like, yeah, maybe I could get a forge in my garage. I don't know. Maybe we could do that. So, but it never would even occur to me. It would never have been on my radar. So you're right. I think that is an interesting thing. It does open people's minds to be able to freely choose, the types of content you're consuming. So
Well, brainwashing, basically brainwashing is when you're repetitively fed information into your brain over and over. And normally brainwashing works best when it's passive, right? Kind of like, you know, saying the
well, here's one for you, just as an example of my programming. 2 all beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. As a
yep,
kid, I saw the
Big
McDonald's
Mac.
commercial 1,000 times, 100,000 times probably.
That's a good one. And it's passive. It wasn't like you intentionally went to watch McDonald's commercials, right? You
Right.
didn't do it on purpose. What you were doing is watching Tom and Jerry, and that's the commercial that popped up in the break,
Mm, that's a
right?
great point. I
So
love it.
now we don't have this, or I'm not saying we don't have brainwashing. I'm saying it's diminished because we intentionally choose our programming now. Now, of course, like you said, there's trade-offs, right? Maybe the trade-off is we start intentionally choosing really shitty programming and our brains become mush and we turn into all the people on the spaceship in Wally, but
I think that's definitely going to happen to the segment of the population, some segment of the population. I just feel like they're too good. The programming is too good not to cause that to happen. But I think, what I'm getting
could
out
be.
of this conversation is that for people, for individuals who do think, for individuals who want to be independent and are naturally independent thinkers and want to serve that side of their brain and freedom and whatever, that this chaos, this disorder that's created in the world today just is a gigantic opportunity. And that's why you're optimistic, fundamentally.
Well, and I'm also, so back to my optimistic perception. Now that we've had this COVID catalyst to force people to work from home, now people are going to gain hours in the day they didn't previously have, right?
Okay.
So now maybe, and again, I'm being optimistic here, but maybe people will start taking time to think, read, read good books, maybe put on an audible book while they're working out in the morning or something like that. But maybe they'll take time to consume, you know, thoughtful material and take time to actually think. Because if you pull that 3, 4, 5, 6 hours of, burn time out of the middle of your day, you just open up freedom to do more things. Of course, if you're a thinking person and you want to improve yourself, you will do that. If you're, a lazy ball of meat, then what are you going to do? You're just going to probably eat more potato chips and
Right.
watch more Friends reruns on the couch, I guess. I don't know, but
But
at least you have the opportunity now to have that time, whereas maybe you didn't have it before.
right. And actually, I think that, one of the things I've used as a parenting strategy, just to kind of wrap this up, is that I've noticed with my kids that all the most creative things that they do, when they do stuff where they get really engaged in what they're doing, it's when before that there is boredom that they experience. When they are not pulled down the entertainment route, it's like, but they get, and I remember as a kid just being so bored all the time because I grew up poor and we had the 4 channels and the antenna TV, and like there was literally nothing to do. And so you just start, experimenting and trying different things and sometimes getting in trouble, but like mostly just seeing what's possible. And I think that if you have this massive addition of free time for people, there's going to be a certain amount of them that just by boredom alone, maybe it cracks open that creativity itch a little bit and gets them thinking better. But you're right, that
That's
extra
my
time,
optimism.
that is optimistic. I think it's
I mean,
possible.
that is my optimism. I think it'll happen. You're right. It won't be 100% of the population, but imagine if it's only 20. Imagine the massive progress we can see if 20% of the people that are obviously on the upper end of the IQ spectrum take this previously wasted 4 hours a day and put it into productive endeavors, thinking, reading something good, starting a small home business, maybe traveling, learning a new language. Like any of these things are productive type things. Imagine if only 20% take this extra 4 hours they just picked up, by this COVID catalyst and do something productive. I think we can see massive, massive improvements in society.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you, Bobby. Thanks for joining me today. And we have and good if you're especially if you're an international oriented person and you're location independent, definitely encourage you to look at Bobby's website, which is globalwealthprotection.com. It's got lots of good
Thank you,
resources
Matt.
on there. Thanks for your time,
All
Bobby.
right. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.